Endgames are clearly a sore spot for a lot of players right now in the Total War community. When I posted my first video criticising the endgame scenarios in Warhammer 3's Immortal Empires, I was expecting far more pushback than I actually wound up receiving. While there are a few people coping and seething in my comment section, they were massively outnumbered by those who were sharing their own stories of how horribly endgames have affected campaigns that they were enjoying, as well as their own ideas for how they would improve endgames if they were given the power to do so. With that in mind, here in part 2 of my endgame discussion, I'll be laying out and explaining changes that I would make to the present system in order to make it more enjoyable and engaging. I would like to note that there are going to be a lot of suggestions that I'll make here, and while it would be great to have all options at our disposal, I'm a realist and thus would only expect to see a few of them implemented. There are also potentially ways in which some of these suggestions may clash if implemented alongside one another, so bear that in mind and take this more as a rundown of the many and differing ways in which endgames could realistically be improved in Warhammer 3. I should also mention that while it would be interesting to have a complete rework that gives us constant storytelling throughout the campaign, CA are not just going to reverse course and change the formula of the game entirely, at least not for a long time. So my suggestions focus upon improving and enhancing the present system, rather than completely discarding and replacing it. The first improvements that I'll suggest are related to the obviously absent characteristics. First up, stop trickling the bloody things out, CA. If the race is in the game, they can have an endgame applied to them. Just give them all over now and stop holding them back as fake content micro releases. If you want selling points for future DLCs, then I have a suggestion for that later on in the video. Second, give us cutscenes for crying out loud. One for the beginning of the endgame, one for the end. Right now, with mere pop-up messaging to indicate that the endgame has begun, you're basically giving the final grand event of every player's campaign all the visible weight of stealing a shield of Tolos after a battle, or getting one of your heroes wounded, so it's simply not good enough. These cutscenes don't need to be huge, expensive affairs, nor do they even need to be fully animated. They could easily be the kind of semi-animated scenes that are used in the Eye of the Vortex and Realms of Chaos campaigns, and are probably best centred on the threat rather than the player's faction, so as not to have to produce as many of them. Next, I'm going to move on to quality of life improvements. I would move the Endgame Settings from this Settings tab on the left to the Faction tabs on the right, where they're more immediately visible when you're selecting your campaign. The reason for this is simple. In terms of their effects on campaigns, endgames are not an overarching and uniform mechanic. Each race has different suitable endgames, and even different factions within a race can have different suitable endgames. Therefore, having them within the Factions tab makes far more sense than having a single overall setting that applies to every campaign unless you change it every single time. Further, for those reasons, I would also add in default settings for every faction. For example, the Empire would default to not having a dwarf endgame and vice versa, but you could turn them on with a checkbox if you want to. In addition to that, for those who for some reason still want the wildly scattergun effect that we have right now, there could be an enable all endgame scenarios checkbox for that faction, or as an overall setting for all factions. Getting into the game itself, I would like to see the return of the mid-game crisis. The small chaos invasion in Warhammer 2 did a reasonable job of breaking monotony in the endgame, at least for some factions, in that it provided a challenge at a point in the game in which campaigns are often snowballing and becoming a bit stale. A smaller version of an endgame crisis coming in early would spice up the game a little, and it wouldn't even need to be related to the grand endgame that would be following as the finale. You could have Skaven for the short one, Greenskins for the final one, for example. Endgames also need to have a dynamic element added to them, affected by the nature of the campaign you've waged. At the start of the campaign, you should start out with essentially a clean slate and all the chosen endgames roughly as likely to happen as each other. Then, as you wage wars, make pacts and alliances, etc., the likelihood should change and adapt. So, for example, if you're playing as Norska and constantly at war with the Empire while having great relations with the Dark Elves, you should gradually become more likely to have an endgame involving either the Empire or one of their close allies, but less likely to have one involving the Druchii. This makes the events of your campaign matter, and turns the endgame from something that's just arbitrarily chosen via random number generator into something that reacts to your gameplay and complements the campaign, rather than simply rewinding it and potentially undoing all of your work. On top of this, I would add in at least 3 extra options for endgames: Order-Tide, Doom-Tide, and Total War. Almost all of us know these terms from discussions dating back to Warhammer 2, but for clarity, an Order-Tide endgame would cause all of the factions categorised as Order to declare war on you, while Doom-Tide would do the same with the evil factions, while Total War would result in every faction declaring war upon you with no hope of peace. The nature of the way the threat is constructed in this game is also a major issue. When I first broached the topic of endgames, I cited an example in which I was playing as Chaos Dwarfs and had wiped out Karaz-Akarak and Karak Kadrina's factions. However, because I got a grudge too far as the endgame, they just came back with new armies and their legendary lords intact. The Chaos invasions in Warhammer 1 and 2 had their issues, but there was never a sense that it was just rewinding the campaign and undoing your progress. That's exactly what endgames do in their current form in Warhammer 3. Instead of the present revivalist system of just bringing dead factions back, I would return to something more like the Chaos Invasion. A new force from the chosen endgame race emerges en masse in a suitable location. Continuing with the dwarf example, let's say they start somewhere in the far south or far north of the World's Edge Mountains, depending on your own faction's location. Then they set about waging war upon you, and if as a part of that they retake a settlement that was formerly a capital of one of the factions within their race, say Karaz-Akarak in this example, then that faction re-emerges as an ally to this new army and an extra threat that is automatically at war with you. This makes the scenario again more dynamic and adds strategic complexity to the campaign. You might find yourself in a position in which you need to sacrifice Karak 8 Peaks, for example, because it's either that or prevent Karaz-Akarak from being retaken, with the risk of the re-emergence of Thorgrim Grudgebearer and a returning faction being at war with you. It's less arbitrary and more a matter of escalation, action and reaction. On top of that, there's also the option to use this system as a way to add value to future DLCs. The emerging Endgame Crisis armies could be led by a generic lord initially, but then when full feature DLCs come out, instead of drip releasing endgames like they are now, they can instead have them all, but introduce lore-friendly lords who could lead these endgame armies from then on, like Joseph Bugman for the dwarfs, or Talaris Dreadbringer for the Dark Elves, etc. Then, if you beat their endgame, you could potentially unlock that lord for your own future campaigns for that faction. So not only would endgames be improved overall, but you'd actually have a reward for playing through them for once. Lastly, I want to look at behaviours from the AI. Each endgame faction should have its own lore-friendly style of play, at least where possible. For example, the dwarf should concentrate strongly upon taking dwarfen holds first and foremost, while greenskin should not be overly concerned with territory in general, but rather upon being a tight, roaming death ball. Skaven should spread wide and fast, while vampires should be more controlled, concentrating on building up their corruption, and so on and so forth. Creative Assembly appear to have been making strides in this area with the Chaos Dwarf endgame, but it's honestly baffling that they didn't go all in on this sooner, given we're almost a year into the life of Immortal Empires. So these are just a few, mostly quite basic and easy to implement ideas, largely off the top of my head, to enhance endgames and make them actually worth playing, which, let's be real here, right now they're really not. It goes without saying that there are other great ideas to be offered, and with that in mind, I'm inviting you to give yours down in the comments section, and if there's interest, I could discuss, review and critique some or all of them in a future video. The next video in this series will revolve around an idea that I have for a reworked version of Immortal Empires itself that I believe is the game that many people really want, were expecting when Warhammer 3's Immortal Empires was announced, and will most enjoy. So hit like, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and I'll see you there.